The rooftop restaurant at the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Los Angeles was not the kind of place where ordinary people wandered in by accident. Every table had a view of the glittering skyline. Every glass was crystal. Every server moved with the practiced silence of someone trained to make wealthy guests feel like the center of the universe. And on that particular Tuesday evening in early autumn, the restaurant was hosting one of the most exclusive private events of the year, a fundraising dinner for the Children's Heart Foundation, attended by some of the most powerful names in technology, finance, and entertainment. That was when the maitre d', a tall, sharp-shouldered man named Gerald Whitmore, noticed the figure standing near the private elevator. He was wearing dark jeans, a plain gray jacket, and carrying nothing but a small canvas tote bag. His hair was a little long, slightly unkempt, and he had the kind of quiet, still posture of a man who had nowhere in particular he needed to be. Gerald crossed the marble floor in long, confident strides and positioned himself directly between the man and the entrance to the dining room. "Sir," Gerald said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of someone exercising authority, "this event is invitation only, private. I'm going to need to ask you to return to the lobby." The man looked at Gerald with calm, dark eyes and offered a small, patient smile. "I believe I'm on the guest list," he said quietly. Gerald raised an eyebrow and glanced down at his tablet with the exaggerated deliberateness of someone who had already made up his mind. "Name." "Keanu Reeves." Gerald scrolled slowly, far too slowly, with the kind of theatrical skepticism that said he wasn't really looking at all. Around them, a few guests near the entrance had already begun to take notice. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her companion and murmured something. A man in a tuxedo glanced over his shoulder and then looked away, the way people do when they've already decided the situation doesn't concern them. "I'm not seeing it," Gerald said flatly, snapping the tablet cover shut. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back to the elevator. The lobby bar is open to all hotel guests." Keanu nodded once slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, "All right, thank you," and stepped back toward the elevator with the unhurried grace of a man who had never once needed a room full of strangers to validate him. But within 45 minutes, every single person in that restaurant would know exactly who they had just turned away, and why it would change at least one life forever. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories about kindness, dignity, and the moments that remind us what really matters, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, the name Marcus Hale had been on the cover of 4 different business magazines simultaneously, a rare distinction that his publicist had proudly framed as a first in the history of American corporate media. At 47 years old, Marcus Hale was the founder and CEO of Vantara Systems, a cloud infrastructure company he had built from a 2-person startup in his garage in Phoenix into a publicly traded enterprise worth more than $60 billion. He had been profiled by every major outlet, interviewed on every major stage, and celebrated by every major institution that liked to celebrate people who had turned nothing into everything through sheer force of will and intelligence. But that was 3 weeks ago. On the morning of the fundraising dinner, Marcus Hale sat alone in a corner suite on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Grand, still wearing the same clothes he had slept in, or rather, the same clothes he had not slept in, because sleep had become a stranger to him over the past several months. The room was dim. The curtains were nearly closed. On the desk beside him sat 3 unopened bottles of water, a room service tray he hadn't touched, and a leather portfolio containing a single handwritten letter he had spent the last 6 hours writing and rewriting to his daughter, who was 16 years old and lived in Seattle with her mother. Marcus had not spoken to his daughter in 4 months, not because of any legal arrangement or official estrangement, but simply because every time he reached for his phone to call her, something inside him went quiet and cold and convinced him that she was better off not hearing whatever was left of his voice. The man who had given keynote addresses to 10,000 people, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals across a conference table without blinking, could not bring himself to dial his own daughter's number. What the magazines didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Marcus Hale had been quietly unraveling for the better part of a year. It had started with the kind of relentless pressure that successful people are expected to absorb without complaint. A failed acquisition that had cost the company $3 billion, a federal investigation into one of his former board members that had dragged his name into headlines he hadn't earned. And then, 6 months ago, a very private medical diagnosis that his doctor had delivered with gentle professionalism, and that Marcus had processed entirely alone, because he had spent so many years building walls between himself and everyone who might have helped him carry the weight. He wasn't dying, not in the immediate medical sense of the word, but something in him had decided, quietly and without drama, that he was finished, that the story had gone on long enough and the ending didn't need to be triumphant. He had attended the fundraising dinner tonight only because his assistant had booked it 3 months ago, and canceling felt like one more failure to add to the list. He had arrived at the restaurant early, before most of the other guests, because he had always preferred arriving first. It was a habit from his startup days, when being early was the only competitive advantage a person with no money and no connections could manufacture. He had stood near the entrance to the rooftop dining room, watching the city lights begin to sharpen against the darkening sky, feeling the strange, hollow peace of a man who has stopped fighting something he no longer has the energy to name. That was when he saw it. Near the elevator, a man in a gray jacket was being turned away by the maitre d'. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular cold efficiency of someone accustomed to deciding who belonged and who didn't. The man being turned away said almost nothing. He thanked the maitre d', which was the part that stopped Marcus cold. He actually thanked him, and then stepped back toward the elevator without any visible trace of humiliation or anger. Marcus watched him go and felt something he hadn't felt in months. He wasn't sure what to call it. It wasn't quite recognition, though there was something vaguely familiar about the man's face. It wasn't pity, because the man had carried himself with more dignity than anyone else in the room. It was something quieter than either of those things. It was the faint, uncomfortable sensation of watching someone handle gracefully the exact thing you have been handling catastrophically. He told himself to forget it and turned back toward his table, but he couldn't entirely let it go. Marcus had been seated at a round table near the center of the room, flanked by 2 other technology executives he recognized by name and reputation, but had never particularly liked. To his left was a man named Douglas Frey, who ran a venture capital firm out of San Francisco and who had a talent for making every conversation feel like a negotiation. To his right was a woman named Priya Weston, the COO of a fintech company that had recently gone public at an absurd valuation, and who wore the particular expression of someone perpetually calculating whether the person they were speaking to was worth their full attention. The dinner began in the way these dinners always began, with polished remarks from the foundation's chairwoman, followed by applause that was enthusiastic enough to be polite and restrained enough to be sophisticated. Waiters moved between tables with choreographed precision. The wine was exceptional. The food was the kind of food that tastes best when you're not thinking about it, which Marcus was not, because he was sitting very still and watching a woman at the adjacent table describe her recent holiday in Tuscany with the breathless enthusiasm of someone recounting a religious experience. Douglas Frey leaned toward Marcus and said, in the conspiratorial tone of a man sharing information he found entertaining rather than troubling, "Did you see what Gerald did at the door tonight? Turned away some guy who looked like he'd wandered in from the wrong building. I mean, this is a $500 a plate dinner. You'd think people would check the dress code before they showed up." Marcus picked up his water glass and didn't answer right away. "Probably a delivery person," Priya offered without looking up from her phone. "Or a journalist. They always try to sneak into these things." Douglas chuckled. "Gerald's good at reading people, you can always tell." Marcus set his glass down carefully. "Can you?" he said. It wasn't a question. Douglas either didn't notice the flatness in his voice or chose to ignore it. "Absolutely. The way someone carries themselves, the way they dress, the way they look at the room, it tells you everything about where they belong." He picked up his fork with the satisfaction of a man who believed what he was saying because it had never once been said about him. Marcus said nothing more on the subject, but he found himself thinking about the man in the gray jacket again, specifically about the way he had said, "All right," and "thank you" to someone who had just dismissed him in front of witnesses. There had been no performance in it, no stiff dignity masking wounded pride. It had been entirely genuine, the response of someone who simply did not measure his own worth by other people's assessments of it. Marcus couldn't remember the last time he had felt that way about anything. He excused himself from the table shortly after the main course arrived and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows at the edge of the rooftop terrace, where the city spread out below him in its enormous, indifferent brilliance. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, not thinking about Vantara systems or the federal investigation or the letter he had written to his daughter. He was thinking about a stranger in a gray jacket who had walked away from humiliation without once looking back, and about how that small, unremarkable moment had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter he couldn't reach. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find that same man, somehow, inexplicably, standing on the terrace. The explanation, it turned out, was simple and completely unglamorous. The hotel's rooftop terrace was accessible not only through the private dining room, but also through a door off the service corridor on the other side of the building, and one of the junior kitchen staff, a 22-year-old named Tamaz, who had been working double shifts for 3 weeks, and who would later describe the encounter as the best thing that had ever happened to him, had left that door propped open while taking a break. The man in the gray jacket had found it, not out of any intention to sneak in or circumvent Gerald's authority, but because he had been sitting in the lobby bar nursing a club soda when a fire alarm test on one of the lower floors had sent a brief, sharp blast of sound through the building, and he had stepped into the nearest stairwell out of an old, reflexive habit of seeking quiet. He had ended up on the terrace purely by accident. When Marcus turned and found him standing there, the man looked neither guilty nor surprised. He looked the way people look when they are discovered doing something entirely innocent, which is to say, he looked mildly amused. "Nice view," the man said. Marcus studied him for a moment. Up close, the familiarity he had sensed from across the room was stronger. The dark, steady eyes, the particular stillness. "You were at the door earlier," Marcus said. "I was," the man agreed easily. "Gerald made a fair call. I should have worn something more appropriate." "You were on the guest list," Marcus said. He didn't know why he was certain of this, but he was. The man smiled, not the polished, strategic smile of someone working a room, but the quiet, genuine kind that reaches the eyes first. "I was," he said again. "But it doesn't matter. The foundation will get my donation either way. That's the part that counts." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Below them, the city moved in its constant, unconscious rhythm, millions of people going about the business of their lives without any awareness of the two men standing above them on a rooftop terrace. "Most people wouldn't see it that way," Marcus said. "Most people would want the credit." "Most people haven't figured out yet that the credit is usually the least interesting part," the man replied. He turned back toward the view and was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they are actually comfortable with silence rather than merely tolerating it. "You looked like you needed some air," he said finally. It wasn't an accusation or an observation designed to open a conversation. It was simply a thing he had noticed, offered without agenda. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I did." They stood together at the railing for a while without speaking, and in that silence something happened that Marcus would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately and always failing, because the closest he could get was this. It felt like being allowed to exist without performing. Like the particular relief of being seen by someone who had no interest in what you were worth, or what you had built, or what was currently falling apart, but was simply willing to stand next to you in the dark and look at the lights. "My name's Marcus," he said eventually. The man nodded. "Keanu," he said. They shook hands, the way people do when the gesture means something rather than nothing, and then they both turned back to the view and let the city do the talking for a while. By the time the dessert course was being served inside, the whispers had already started. It had begun, as these things usually do, with someone's phone. A young woman seated near the windows, a junior associate at one of the sponsoring law firms, attending her first event of this kind and still slightly dazzled by the company she was keeping, had glanced out through the glass toward the terrace and done a slow, silent double take. She had leaned toward the colleague beside her and said very quietly, is that Keanu Reeves out there?" Her colleague had looked, squinted slightly, and pulled out her phone without a word. Within 10 minutes, the information had moved through the room in the particular way that celebrity recognition spreads through a crowd, not as an announcement, not as a rumor exactly, but as a gathering certainty that travels from table to table in murmurs and redirected glances until it becomes the ambient awareness of the entire room. People craned their necks with varying degrees of subtlety. Someone near the bar said the name out loud, and then immediately looked embarrassed for having said it. A man who had been holding court at the corner table about his recent series, B funding round, trailed off mid-sentence and turned toward the window. Gerald Whitmore, standing near the entrance to the dining room with the composed expression he maintained at all times regardless of internal experience, had his composure tested rather severely when one of the senior waitstaff approached him and said, in a low voice that was approximately 30% calmer than she actually felt, "Gerald, the man you sent back downstairs. Someone is saying it's Keanu Reeves." Gerald maintained his expression with considerable effort. "I'm sure that's not," he began. "I looked him up," the waitress said carefully. She turned her phone so he could see the screen, a Getty image from some event, dark eyes, familiar stillness, same gray jacket. "Gerald, that's him." Inside Gerald Whitmore, something shifted in a way that he would not be able to fully process until much later that night in the privacy of his own home. On the outside, he straightened his jacket, set his jaw, and said, "I'll handle it," which was both true and deeply insufficient. What Gerald did not know yet, what almost no one in that room knew, was that Keanu Reeves had been connected to the Children's Heart Foundation for years. Not in the visible, publicized way that celebrities often attach their names to causes for the warmth of the association, but in the quiet, consistent, anonymous way that requires neither audience nor recognition. He had lost his daughter, Ava Archer, shortly after her birth in 1999. That loss had shaped him in ways that he almost never spoke about publicly, but that had directed an enormous amount of his private generosity toward organizations focused on children's health and grief support. The foundation had known for months that he would be attending the dinner. His name was on the list. His donation, substantial enough to fund a new pediatric cardiac monitoring program at 3 hospitals, had been arranged weeks in advance. None of this was visible from the outside. None of it was designed to be. Out on the terrace, Marcus Hale had no idea who he was standing next to. He had been too absorbed in his own private darkness to recognize a face he had certainly seen before, and Keanu had offered no information about himself beyond his first name, which was not uncommon in a city where first names were currency and last names were armor. What Marcus did know, by the time they had been standing together for nearly 30 minutes, was that the man beside him had a way of asking questions that made you feel like the answer actually mattered to him. He had asked Marcus at some point during their conversation whether he had family in the city, and Marcus had said no, not really, and then had found himself, to his own considerable surprise, saying something about his daughter in Seattle. Not the full weight of it, not the letter on the desk or the 4 months of silence or the quiet, terrible conclusion he had been inching toward, but enough of it to feel like a door opening slightly in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. Keanu had listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Keanu was quiet for a moment before he said, "Kids are resilient in ways we don't give them credit for, but they're also waiting in ways we don't always see. She probably picks up the phone every time it rings and hopes it's you." Marcus didn't answer. He pressed his lips together and looked at the city. His jaw moved slightly, the way a person's jaw moves when they are choosing between saying something honest and saying nothing at all. He chose nothing, but the door stayed open. Gerald Whitmore crossed the terrace with the kind of purposeful stride he had spent years perfecting, the stride of a man who is in charge, and intends to remain so, and stopped a few feet from the 2 men at the railing. His expression was composed and professional, but there was something working behind his eyes that had not been there an hour ago. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice was steady, "I owe you a sincere apology. There was a misunderstanding at the entrance earlier this evening, and it should not have happened. Your name was on the guest list, and I failed to find it. I'm very sorry." Keanu turned and regarded Gerald with an expression that contained no satisfaction and no edge. "It's completely all right," he said, and he meant it in the simple, uncomplicated way that most people struggle to mean when they say it. "These things happen. You were doing your job." Gerald had been prepared, in some distant corner of his professional instincts, for graciousness. What he had not been prepared for was the complete absence of any subtext, no gracious performance concealing wounded pride, no magnanimity designed to heighten the contrast with his earlier behavior. Just a man who genuinely did not hold the incident against him, because the incident had never lodged in him the way it would have lodged in almost anyone else. Gerald nodded and said, "The Foundation's director is inside and would very much like to speak with you when you're ready. There's no rush at all. He glanced briefly at Marcus, not rudely, but with the faint, involuntary recalibration of a man who has just realized he has been standing very close to something large without noticing it, and then quietly withdrew. Marcus watched him go and then looked at Keanu with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something he should probably have understood earlier. "Keanu Reeves," he said, not a question. Keanu smiled. "You didn't know." "I haven't been paying a lot of attention lately," Marcus said. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in months. Keanu looked at him for a moment with those quiet, steady eyes. "That tracks," he said gently. "Sometimes the world gets loud and you go somewhere else for a while. There's nothing wrong with that." He paused. "As long as you come back." Marcus looked away toward the city, and something in his chest tightened in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The tightening of something that has been numb beginning, cautiously, to feel again. Inside the restaurant, meanwhile, Gerald had returned to the entrance and was standing very still with the practiced composure of someone conducting a thorough internal audit. He thought about the way he had scrolled through the guest list with deliberate slowness, the theatrical snap of the tablet cover, the way he had directed the man toward the lobby as though he were redirecting a stranger who had wandered through the wrong door. He thought about Douglas Frey saying you can always tell, and about the fact that what you could tell, almost always, was considerably less than you imagined. He thought about the 47 other events he had managed in this room, and about how many times he had made the same calculation, and whether he had always been wrong in the same direction. It was not a comfortable audit, but it was an honest one, and that in the end is worth something. Her name was Catherine Osai, and she had been running the Children's Heart Foundation for 11 years with the combination of tireless energy and quiet ferocity that the work demanded. She was 61 years old, had lost her own son to a congenital heart defect when he was 7, and had channeled that grief into an organization that had, over the past decade, funded cardiac research, paid for surgeries for children whose families couldn't afford them, and established a nationwide grief counseling network for parents navigating the particular devastation of losing a child to heart disease. Catherine had known Keanu Reeves was coming tonight and had been looking forward to seeing him, not with the excitement of celebrity proximity, but with the genuine warmth of someone who had watched a person show up, quietly and consistently, for something that mattered. She found him on the terrace, still standing beside a man she didn't recognize, and she crossed the space between them with her hand already extended. "Keanu," she said, and the relief and affection in her voice were entirely unperformed. He took her hand in both of his and held it for a moment. "Catherine, you look wonderful. How is everything going?" "Beautifully," she said, and then, because she was not someone who managed information when honesty was available, she added, "And also we're down about 400,000 from where I hoped we'd be tonight, but the evening isn't over and I've learned to trust the process." She said this with the particular dry humor of someone who has been doing difficult work long enough to find it occasionally funny. Keanu introduced Marcus simply as a friend he'd been talking to outside, and Catherine greeted him with the warm directness of a woman who assessed people by their eyes rather than their business cards. Marcus, who had been preparing to make an excuse to return to his table, found himself instead drawn into conversation with her in a way that took him slightly by surprise, because Catherine Ose had the rare quality of making people feel that what they had to say was actually worth the time it took to say it. She told him about the Foundation's current initiative, a pediatric cardiac monitoring program that would provide continuous heart monitoring for at-risk children in 3 states, catching arrhythmias and anomalies that were currently going undetected until they became emergencies. She described it with technical precision and emotional clarity in equal measure, the way only someone who understood the subject from both inside and outside could, and Marcus listened with an attentiveness he had not given to anything in months. "How much does the program cost to launch?" he asked. Catherine looked at him with the calm, direct appraisal of someone who had been asked this question many times and had learned to read the tone behind it. $4.2 million to fully fund all 3 sites for the first 2 years, she said. "We're about 60% of the way there." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to cover the rest," he said. The terrace was quiet except for the distant sound of the city below. Catherine held his gaze for a long moment, reading him the way she had learned to read people across 11 years of this work, for sincerity, for the particular quality of attention that indicated a commitment rather than an impulse. What she saw made her exhale slowly and say, with great simplicity, "Thank you, Marcus." Keanu said nothing. He simply stood beside them, looking at the city, his hands in his pockets, the way a person stands when they are witnessing something that doesn't need their commentary. The junior kitchen staff member who had left the service corridor door propped open, Tomás Guerrero, had been working at the Meridian Grand for 8 months. Ever since his family had relocated to Los Angeles from El Paso, following a series of circumstances that had not been easy and had not been entirely within their control. His father had suffered a stroke the previous spring, at 54, that had left him with partial paralysis on his left side and an inability to return to the construction work that had been the family's primary income for 20 years. His mother cleaned houses 6 days a week. Tomás worked double and sometimes triple shifts at the hotel, took online courses in culinary management on his phone during breaks, and sent money home every 2 weeks with the regularity of someone who had accepted responsibility not as a burden, but as a fact. He was a good worker. His supervisors noted it without always acting on it. He was the kind of reliable that institutions depend on and rarely reward, the quiet workhorse who shows up without fanfare and whose absence is felt far more acutely than his presence is celebrated. When the head chef, a demanding and exacting woman named Sylvie Marchand, discovered that the corridor door had been left open and that an unauthorized person had accessed the terrace during a private event, she handled the situation the way she handled most situations, with controlled, efficient anger. She pulled Tomás aside during the service and told him in clipped, precise terms that this was a serious lapse in protocol, that the hotel could not afford security incidents at events of this caliber, and that she would be filing a formal incident report that could affect his continued employment. Tomás stood through this with the still, careful posture of someone who has learned that defending yourself in certain rooms only makes things worse. He said, "Yes, chef, I understand. I'm sorry." He meant both sentences. Then he went back to work and finished the service with the same focused efficiency he always brought, because the situation at home required his paycheck with a regularity that did not accommodate the luxury of falling apart at work. He didn't know that the person who had walked through the door he'd left open was anyone remarkable. He didn't know about any of it, not the terrace conversation, not the donation, not Catherine Osai's reaction to Marcus Hale's offer. He just knew that he had made a mistake during an event that mattered, and that the consequences might be significant, and that he would figure out how to deal with it the way he figured out everything else, which was one day at a time. After the service ended and the last guests began to drift toward the elevators, Tomás was breaking down a prep station when one of the senior servers, a woman named Diane who had worked at the hotel for 12 years and who had an accurate and unsentimental read on most situations, appeared at his side and said quietly, "The man you let onto the terrace wants to speak with you before he leaves." Tomás looked at her. "What?" "Don't ask me questions," Diane said. "Just come." Tomás found Keanu Reeves standing near the elevator bank with Catherine Osai, and the first thing he noticed was that neither of them looked angry. The second thing he noticed was that Keanu Reeves was looking at him with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated interest, the kind that registers a person as a full human being rather than a function. "You're Tomás," Keanu said. "Yes," Tomás said carefully. "Diane tells me you've been working here 8 months, double shifts most weeks." It wasn't an accusation. It was the opening of a conversation. "Yes," Tomás said again. "And you're taking courses online, culinary management." Tomás blinked. He didn't know how this man knew that, and he wasn't sure whether to be unsettled or to simply stand there and see what came next. "I am," he said. Keanu nodded slowly. "The door thing, that's not going to be a problem for you. I've spoken with the hotel manager. It was an unusual night and the context is clear. Nobody's filing anything." He said it plainly, without the self-congratulation that people sometimes attach to good news they're delivering, and Tomás felt something release in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was clenched. "But that wasn't all." Catherine stepped forward and said, "Tomás, your name came up in a conversation tonight about the Foundation's operational team. We're expanding into a new program that requires people with your exact combination of skills: event coordination, food service management, someone who knows how to work in high-pressure, high-standard environments. The position comes with a salary that I suspect would be meaningful to your family." She handed him a card. Call me this week, I mean it. Tamaz held the card and looked at it for a long moment. His expression was the expression of a person who has trained themselves not to hope for things they might not get, encountering something they had not prepared for. Why? He said, not ungratefully, just genuinely needing to understand. Because the people who show up quietly and do the work well are exactly the people organizations like mine need, Catherine said simply. What Tamaz didn't know in that moment, what would only emerge over the following weeks as the story of that evening circulated in the quiet, unhurried way that meaningful stories do, was that he was not the only person Keanu had quietly intervened for that night. There was also the woman at the coat check, a single mother named Renata, whose daughter needed a procedure their insurance had denied, and whose situation had come up in a brief, apparently unremarkable conversation that Keanu had struck up while waiting for his jacket. He had asked her 2 questions and listened to her answer, and then, without announcement, had a conversation with Catherine about the Foundation's patient assistance program before he had even made it to the terrace. Renata would receive a call from the Foundation 3 days later that would change the entire trajectory of her family's next 6 months. There was also a parking attendant named Jerome, who was 17 and who had mentioned, in the 30 seconds it took to retrieve Keanu's modest rental car, that he was trying to decide whether to apply to film school or take a job his uncle was offering at his contracting business, because his family needed the income more than they needed his ambitions. Keanu had said very quietly, "Apply to the school. I'll make sure the money isn't the thing that stops you." Jerome had not fully believed him in the moment, because people said things in parking lots at midnight that they didn't always mean. But a week later, he received an anonymous scholarship notification from a foundation he had never heard of, and when he looked it up, the trail eventually, many layers deep, through a labyrinth of carefully maintained anonymity, led somewhere that made him stand in his kitchen and shake his head slowly for a long time. None of this was designed to be discovered. All of it was simply what Keanu Reeves did, consistently, without witness or record, in the way that some people breathe, not because they are performing generosity, but because it is simply how they move through the world. Douglas Frey left the event slightly later than he had intended, because he had been absorbed in a conversation about emerging markets that was going well, and that he had no particular reason to cut short. He was waiting near the elevator when he overheard one of the Foundation staff saying Keanu Reeves's name, and then, a moment later, he actually saw him, in full, in context, not as a distant figure through a window, but as a man standing 10 feet away, talking to a young kitchen worker with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. Douglas stood very still for a moment. He replayed, with the unwilling precision of a mind that was actually quite sharp when it chose to be, the conversation at the dinner table. You can always tell. The dress code. Gerald made a fair call. The quiet, satisfied certainty with which he had assessed and dismissed a man he had never spoken to, based on nothing more than a jacket and a travel bag. He replayed it, and it did not improve with the retelling. Douglas Frey was not, at his core, a cruel man. He was a man who had spent so long in rooms where appearance and signal and affiliation were the primary currencies that he had gradually, without ever deciding to, come to believe that these things were the same as substance. He had confused the map for the territory so many times that he had stopped noticing the difference. And standing in the elevator lobby of a hotel rooftop restaurant, watching a man he had quietly dismissed speak with extraordinary care and attention to a young worker who had made a small mistake, Douglas understood with the particular clarity of genuine shame that he had been wrong in a way that went well beyond this evening. He didn't approach Keanu. There was nothing he could have said that wouldn't have been primarily about making himself feel better, and he knew it. He took the elevator down in silence and stood in the lobby for a while before calling his car, turning the evening over in his mind with the honest, effortful discomfort of a person choosing to actually learn something rather than simply letting the feeling pass. Gerald Whitmore had a similar experience, though quieter and more private. He finished his shift with complete professionalism and drove home along the same route. He always drove and went through the same evening routine he always followed. And then he sat in his kitchen for a long time with a cup of tea that went cold and thought about all the doors he had closed with such confident efficiency over the years, and about what might have been on the other side of them, and about what exactly it was that he thought he could tell. Marcus Hale returned to his room on the 42nd floor at 11:47 at night, and the letter to his daughter was still on the desk where he had left it, and the room was still dim, and the city was still enormous and indifferent outside the window. But something had changed in the architecture of the room, or in the architecture of him, in a way that was difficult to locate precisely but impossible to ignore. He stood at the window for a while and thought about what Keanu had said on the terrace. She probably picks up the phone every time it rings and hopes it's you. And about Catherine Ose describing the children her organization worked with, and about Tamaz standing with complete dignity in a situation that had required none, and about the strange, unexpected comfort of standing next to a stranger in the dark and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that the darkness was not the final word on anything. He picked up his phone. It was late, nearly midnight, too late to call Seattle, too late to have the kind of conversation that the situation deserved. He opened the texting app instead and spent 23 minutes writing and deleting and rewriting a message to his daughter, not the polished, strategic communications he had spent his career producing, not the carefully managed emotional disclosure of a man protecting himself, but something much simpler and much more difficult, which was the truth. He wrote, "I know it's been too long. I've been going through something I didn't know how to talk about, and I handled it by going quiet when I should have called. I'm sorry for that. I'm going to do better. I love you very much and I miss you every day. Can we talk this week?" He stared at it for a long time. Then he sent it. He set the phone face down on the desk and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the city, and a few minutes later the phone buzzed and he turned it over and his daughter had written back 3 words. "Yes. Call tomorrow." Marcus Hale sat in that chair for a long time after that, not moving, with the phone held in both hands like something fragile and irreplaceable. And the tears that came were the kind that don't announce themselves in advance, the kind that arrive from somewhere much deeper than the present moment, carrying with them the accumulated weight of months of silence and isolation, and the particular lonely grief of a person who had told himself for too long that he was beyond help and beyond rescue. He was not beyond help, he had never been. He called his doctor the following morning and told the truth about where he had been for the past several months. He began seeing a therapist, a real one, not the executive coaching variety he had used before to maintain the appearance of self-awareness without risking any actual change. He flew to Seattle 2 weeks later and took his daughter to dinner, and they sat across from each other in a restaurant that was nothing like the Meridian Grand. And she looked at him with the particular expression that teenagers wear when they are hoping something is real and afraid it might not be. And he told her that he was not going anywhere, and he meant it in every sense. He funded the pediatric cardiac monitoring program, as he had promised. He also, quietly and without announcement, made a substantial additional gift to the Foundation's grief counseling network, the part of the organization that supported parents navigating loss. Because he understood by then that grief left alone in a sealed room does not stay quiet indefinitely, and that the people who had built a place where it could be spoken and witnessed and carried with company were doing some of the most important work in the world. He never released a press statement about any of it. His communications team asked, and he said no. Some things are not for the press release. Some things are for the thing itself. The story of that Tuesday evening at the Meridian Grand circulated for a while in the way these stories do, through the Foundation staff, through the hotel's back corridors, through the careful, warm telling and retelling of the people who had been there. Tamaz took the job with the Foundation and turned out to be exactly what Catherine had seen in him. Jerome applied to film school and got in. Renata's daughter had her procedure. The monitoring program launched at all 3 hospital sites the following spring, and in its first 18 months of operation, identified 47 children with previously undetected cardiac conditions, several of whom would certainly have experienced serious medical events without the intervention. Keanu Reeves did not give an interview about the evening. He rarely did about anything. When asked, in a general context, how he thought about generosity and giving, he had said once, in a conversation that was partially transcribed somewhere online, that he didn't really think of it as generosity so much as attention, paying attention to the people in front of you and responding to what was actually there, rather than to the category you'd assign them to. Gerald Whitmore changed the check-in protocol for private events. The new protocol required 2 separate staff members to review the guest list simultaneously, eliminating the single point of failure that had led to the incident. And it also, less formally, involved Gerald telling his team during the next staff meeting that their job was not to judge whether someone belonged, but to find out whether they did, which was a different thing entirely, and one that required a completely different kind of attention. Douglas Frey took longer. Real change usually does. But 18 months later, he co-funded a scholarship program for first-generation college students, entirely anonymously, and told exactly one person about it, which was his therapist, and the conversation was less about congratulating himself and more about understanding why it had taken him so long to understand something that should have been obvious. That conversation was harder and more valuable than the donation. Both were necessary. Marcus Hale is still the CEO of Vantara Systems. He still works long hours and carries the weight of a large organization with all the complexity that entails. But the letter is gone from the desk. His daughter visited him in Los Angeles last summer, and they went hiking in Griffith Park, and she took a photograph of them at the top and sent it to him the next morning with no caption, just the image. The two of them standing in the light with the city below them, squinting slightly into the sun, alive. He has it as his phone wallpaper. He will probably keep it there for the rest of his life. Sometimes the person we dismiss in the doorway is carrying more than we can see. Sometimes the person standing quietly at the edge of a room, asking nothing and offering everything, is the one who changes the direction of a life. We walk past them every day, in lobbies, in parking lots, on terraces, in the corridor of a hospital, in the ordinary, humming spaces where the world keeps turning without ceremony. Respect was never meant to be a door with a guest list. It was always meant to be the air, present everywhere, available to everyone, the basic minimum that human beings owe each other before they know a single other thing. The strongest people in any room are rarely the ones who announce it. They are the ones who, when the night is over and the lights are down and the story has finally been told, were busy the whole time paying attention to someone else. There is a particular kind of morning that follows a night when everything quietly shifts. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of morning where the sun bursts through the curtains and music swells, and a person stands at the window with renewed purpose blazing in their eyes. The real kind. The kind where you wake up in the same bed, in the same body, with the same complicated history sitting beside you on the nightstand like a patient, familiar stranger. And yet something in the room is different in a way that you cannot fully explain to anyone who wasn't there to feel it. Marcus Hale had that morning 2 days after the fundraising dinner, when he woke earlier than usual, lay still in the gray pre-dawn quiet of his hotel room, and realized that for the first time in several months, he was thinking about the future in terms of what he wanted it to contain rather than what he wanted it to end. That distinction sounds small. It was not small. It was, in fact, the entire distance between one kind of life and another. He lay there for a long time before getting up, and while he lay there, he thought about his daughter, about the 3 words she had texted back, "Yes, call tomorrow," and about the way those 3 words had felt in his hands when he read them, like something he had not realized he was waiting for until it finally arrived. He thought about Catherine Ose describing the monitoring program with the particular combination of technical precision and human urgency that only comes from someone who has understood a problem from every possible angle, including the one where the problem has a face and a name and belongs to someone you loved. He thought about Tamaz standing with complete composure in a situation that had not been fair to him, and about what it meant to maintain your dignity when the room around you had temporarily decided you didn't deserve any. He thought about Keanu Reeves saying, with the easy sincerity of a man who had never once needed to perform authenticity because he had simply always been it, that the credit was usually the least interesting part. Marcus was not the kind of man who arrived at insights and immediately translated them into action. He was, by temperament and by the particular conditioning of 20 years in the technology industry, someone who processed things slowly and thoroughly, and who generally distrusted epiphanies on the grounds that they tended to be more about the feeling of understanding than the substance of it. So he did not leap out of bed that morning with a transformed worldview and a 5-point plan for his emotional reconstruction. He got up slowly, made coffee from the room service machine, and sat at the desk for a long time with the untouched letter to his daughter still in the leather portfolio beside him. And he thought carefully, and without rushing about what he actually wanted his life to look like from this point forward. What he arrived at after an hour of honest internal accounting was this. He had spent 20 years building things and almost no time at all inhabiting them. He had constructed a company, a reputation, a net worth, and a public identity with the focused intensity of someone who believed that the building was the point. That once the thing was built, the living would somehow follow naturally and effortlessly, like a reward that arrived automatically once you had earned it. What he understood now, sitting in a dim hotel room with cold coffee and a letter he had finally stopped rewriting, was that the living was not a reward. It was the thing itself. It was the only thing, and everything else, the company, the reputation, the $60 billion was context. The center of the picture had always been the people, and he had been so busy building the frame that he had forgotten to look at what was inside it. He called his daughter at 9 that morning, not noon, not evening, not after mentally rehearsing the conversation into something polished and manageable. He called when he was still uncertain and slightly underprepared and a little afraid, which was exactly when the call needed to happen, because his daughter did not need a prepared speech from a composed executive. She needed her father, in whatever condition he was currently in, present and honest, and on the other end of the line. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful at first, the careful voice of someone who has learned to protect themselves from disappointment by not fully arriving until the situation proves it is safe to do so. Marcus heard that careful quality and recognized it immediately, because it was a version of the same guardedness he had been carrying for months, the same instinct to stay slightly behind the glass where nothing could reach you but nothing could hurt you either. He recognized it and felt the full weight of the fact that he had taught her that by example, without ever intending to, simply by being absent in all the ways that mattered while being present in all the ways that didn't. He said he missed her. He said he was sorry for the silence. He said he had been in a dark place that he was beginning to find his way out of, and that he had not handled it well, and that she deserved better than the version of him she had been getting for the past year. He said he was coming to Seattle. She was quiet for a moment after that, the specific silence of someone deciding whether to let something be real, and then she said, "Okay," in the small, genuine voice of a 16-year-old who has been waiting a long time to say exactly that. They talked for 40 minutes, and by the end her voice had lost its careful quality entirely, and she was telling him about a teacher who had said something annoying and a friend who had done something funny, and a book she had been reading that she thought he might actually like. And Marcus sat at the hotel desk with his forehead resting in one hand and his eyes closed, listening to his daughter talk about her ordinary, irreplaceable life. The cardiac monitoring program launched the following spring. Marcus sat in the back row at the hospital event and watched nurses demonstrate the equipment to a group of parents whose faces carried the particular mixture of fear and relief that belongs to people whose children are at risk and who have just been handed a better chance. He did not speak. He had told Catherine he preferred not to, and she had understood without needing it explained. Tomás Guerrero joined the Foundation's operations team and brought to the work exactly what Catherine had seen in him: the focused, unhurried competence of someone who had learned to handle difficulty without losing composure, and the specific empathy of a person who knew what it felt like to be underestimated. He was promoted twice in his first year. Jerome got into film school and is now in his second year, working on a documentary about families who have lost children to cardiac conditions. A project connected, in ways he is still discovering, to a single Tuesday night in autumn when a man in a gray jacket walked through a door left open by accident. Gerald Whitmore is quieter now, more careful, more deliberate, more aware of the weight that a single moment of judgment can carry in another person's life. He told his team that their job was not to decide whether someone belonged, but to find out whether they did. The distinction made them better at everything. Douglas Frey is in the process of becoming someone different, which is the most honest thing that can be said about anyone. He asks more questions now. He interrupts less. He has begun to notice the gap between the quick, confident assessments he was trained to make and the more complicated reality on the other side of them, and while he does not always succeed in bridging it, he is making the effort, which is not nothing. It is actually most of what growth looks like from the inside. Marcus Hale is still the CEO of Vantara Systems. His daughter visited last summer and they went hiking in Griffith Park, and she took a photograph of them at the top and sent it to him the next morning with no caption, just the two of them standing in the light with the city below, squinting slightly into the sun, alive. It is still his phone wallpaper. He will probably keep it there for the rest of his life. The man in the gray jacket went home that night the way he always went home, quietly, without announcement, carrying nothing that required anyone else to carry for him. He had been turned away from a door. He had ended up on a terrace. He had stood next to a stranger in the dark and said a few true things and listened to a few more. None of it had felt like heroism to him because it wasn't. It was just the basic work of being a human being in the presence of other human beings, done with the consistency and care that transforms ordinary moments into the ones people carry with them for the rest of their lives. We all have the capacity for that. Most of us are just waiting for a reason to use it. The reason is always standing right in front of you.